reading M. Laxmikant's 7th edition. This is the first chapter of M. Laxmikant. This line, part first, because in this book there are, I think, 10 parts are available. Part is constitutional framework. In this part, there are 12 chapters. In this part first, constitutional framework, today we'll know about historical background. The first chapter, historical background. The Britishers came to India in 608 as traders in the form of the East India Company, which had the rights of trading in India under a charter granted by Queen Elizabeth I in 1600. In 1765, the company, which till then had purely trading functions, obtained the Diwani of Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa. Diwani means rights over revenue and civil justice. This started its career as a territorial power. In 1858, in the wake of Sepoy mutiny, the British Crown assumed direct responsibility for the governance of India. This rule continued until India was granted independence on August 15, 1947. With independence came the need for a constitution. Hence, a constituent assembly was formed for the purpose in 1946, and on January 26, 1950, the constitution came into being. However, various features of the Indian constitution and polity polity have their roots in the British rule. There were certain events in the British rule that laid down the legal framework for the organization and functioning of government and administration. These events have greatly influenced our constitution and polity. They are explained here in a chronological order under the two major headings. First heading is the company rule, and second is the company rule starts from 1773 to 1858, and the crown rule 1858 to 1947. So firstly we'll know about company rule 1773 to 1858. In this era, we'll know many acts that are came in this era, in this period. So first act is Regulating Act of 1773. This act was of great constitutional importance as it was the first step taken by the British government to control and regulate the affairs of the East India Company in India. Secondly, it recognized for the first time the political and administrative functions of the company, and it laid the foundations of central administration in India. So, what is this act? The features of this act were as follows. First, it designated the Governor of Bengal as the Governor General of Bengal and created an exclusive council of 4 members to assist him. The first such governor was Lord Warren Hastings. Secondly, it made the governors of Bombay and Madras presidencies subordinate to the Governor General of Bengal. Unlike earlier, when the three presidencies were independent, of one another. Thirdly, it provided for the establishment of a Supreme Court at Calcutta 1774, comprising one Chief Justice and three other judges. It prohibited the servants of company from engaging in any private trade or accepting uh, present or bribes from the natives. And lastly, it strengthened the control of British government over the company by requiring the court of directors, governing body of the company, to report on its revenue, civil and military affairs in India. Now we discuss about amending Act of 1781. Amending Act of 1781. So why these names amending? Because in a bid of in a bid to rectify the defects of regulating Act of 1773, the British Parliament passed the amending Act of 1781, also known as the Act of Settlement. So what are the features of this act? The features of this act were as follows. Firstly, it exempted the Governor General and Council from the jurisdiction of the Supreme Court for the acts carried out by them in their official capacity. Similarly, it also exempted the servants of the company from the jurisdiction of Supreme Court for their official actions. And secondly, it excluded the revenue matters and the matters arising in the collection of revenue from the jurisdiction of the Supreme Court. Thirdly, it provided the Supreme Court was to have jurisdiction over all the inhabitants of Calcutta. It also required the Court of Administrator to personal law of the defendants, like Hindus were to be treated Hindus were to be tried according to the Hindu law, and Muslims were to be tried according the Mohammedan law. And fourth point is that it laid down the appeals from the provincial courts could be taken to the Governor General and Council and not to the Supreme Court. And it empowered the Governor General in Council to frame regulations for the provincial courts and councils. So these are two acts is not so much important. Now we move toward third act, and this is very important. Pitt's India Act of 1784. The next important act was the Pitt's India Act of 1784. The features of this act were as follows, like it designated it distinguished between the commercial and political functions of the company. And secondly, it allowed the court of directors to manage the commercial affairs. Look, for the commercial affairs, this is the body is called court of directors, existing body, but created a new body called the board of control to manage the political affairs. Thus it established a system of double government. Look, it is very important point, like court of directors managed the commercial affairs and the board of control. Court of directors means COD. Managed commercial affairs in that time, and the board of control managed political affairs. Board of control. So it was a new created body, And thirdly, it empowered the board of control survive, sorry, to supervise and direct all operations of the civil and military government or revenue of the British possessions in India. Thus, the act was significant for two reasons. First, the company's territories in India were for the first time called the British possessions in India, and second, the British government was given to supreme control over the company's affairs and its administration in India. So now we move towards act, and this is Act of 1786. It is not so much important, but it is. So in 1786, Lord Cornwallis was appointed as the Governor General of Bengal. He placed two demands. He placed two demands to accept the post. He said he should be given power to override decision of his council in special cases. Secondly, he would also be the commander in chief. Accordingly, the Act of 1786 was enacted to make both the provisions. So this was the act. So we knew all these acts, and now we move toward the first Charter Act of 1793. So now we will see that all the charters will come in the difference of 20 years. So first act, the Charter Act of 1793. The feature of this act, Charter Act of 1793, were: it extended the overriding power given to Lord Cornwallis over his council to all future governor generals and governors of the presidencies. So it extended the overriding power to given to the Lord Cornwallis over his council to all future governor generals and governors of the presidencies. And secondly, it gave the Governor General more powers and control over the governments of the subordinate presidencies of Bombay and Madras. It extended the trade monopoly of the company in India for a period of another 20 years. It provided the commander-in-chief was not to be a member of Governor General's Council unless he was so appointed. And lastly, the it laid down that the member of the board of control and their staff were henceforth to be paid out of the Indian revenues. So in this act, this was the most important provision, and that is, what is this? It laid down the members of the board of control BOD and their staff were henceforth to be paid out of the Indian revenues. So this was the first charter, and now we'll know about second charter and Charter Act of 1813. The features of the act were as follows: it abolished the trade monopoly of the company in India. It abolished. The Indian trade was thrown open to all British merchants. However, it continued the monopoly of the company over trade in tea and trade with China. It asserted the sovereignty of the British Crown over the company's territories in India. It allowed the Christian missionaries to come to India for the purpose of enlightening the people. So basically, they were trying to spread their religion. It provided spread of Western education among the inhabitants of the British territories in India. And lastly, it authorized to local governments in India to impose taxes on persons, and they could also punish the persons for not paying taxes. So this was the second charter and last. Now we'll know about third Charter Act of 1833. So 1833, this act was the final step towards centralized. Sorry, this act was the final step towards centralization in British India. So it was a peak in the order of centralization. The features of this act were as follows. Firstly, it made the Governor General of Bengal as the Governor General of India and vested in him all civil and military powers. Thus the act vested for the first time the government of India with entire territorial area possessed by the British in India. Lord William Bentinck was the first Governor General of India. And secondly, this charter, what did it deprived the governor of Bombay and Madras of their legislative powers. The Governor General of India was given exclusive legislative powers for the entirely of British India. The laws, the laws made under the previous acts were called as regulations, while law made under this act were called as acts. So there are two types of acts basically. Previous acts called regulations and newly was acts. And third point is it ended the activities of East India Company as a commercial body which became a purely administrative body. It provided that the company's territories in India were held by it in trust of His Majesty, His heirs, and successors. And the fourth point is the Charter of 1833 attempted to introduce a system of open competition for the selection of civil servants and stated that the Indians should not be debarred from holding any place, office, and employment under the company. However, the provision was not negated after the provision was negated after opposition from the court of directors. So basically, court of director uh, was the negative factor in this. So the Charter Act of 1833 attempted to introduce a system of open competition for selection of civil servants. But basically, in reality, the provision of civil servants for Indians was in Charter Act of 1853. So now we know about the Charter Act of 1853. This was the last of the series of Charter Acts passed by British Parliament between 1793 to 1853. It was a significant constitutional landmark. The features of this act were as follows. It separated for the first time the legislative and executive. the legislative and the executive functions of the Governor General's Council. Sorry, it provided for the it provided it provided for the addition of six new members called Legislative Council. It separated for the first time the legislative and executive functions of the Governor General's Council. It provided for the addition of six new members called legislative councillors to the council. In the other words, in other words, it established a separate Governor General's Legislative Council, which came to be known as the Indian Central Legislative Council. This legislative wing of the council functioned as a mini parliament, adopting the same procedures as the British Parliament. Thus, legislation for the first time was treated as a special functions of the government requiring special machinery and special process. Secondly, it introduced an open competition system of selection and recruitment of civil servants. As I told to you, the con, uh, covenanted service, the covenanted civil service was thus thrown open to Indians also. Accordingly, the Macaulay Committee, the Committee on the Indian Civil Service, was appointed in 1854. It extended the company's rule and allowed it to retain the possession of Indian territories on trust for the British Crown, but it did not specify any particular period, unlike the previous charters. This was a clear indication that the company's rule could be terminated as any time of the parliament liked. And lastly, it introduced for the first time local representation in Indian Legislative Council. So it was a central legislative council. Of the six new legislative members of the Governor General's Council, four members were appointed by the local provincial governments of Madras, Bombay, Bengal, and Agra. So this was the company rule, and now we'll know about the crown rule. So in crown rule, the Government of India Act of 1858 was the first act. The Government of India Act of 1858. What says this act? This significant act was enacted in the wake of revolt of 1850 as the first war of independence or the Sepoy Mutiny, the act known as the Act of Good Government of India, abolished the East India Company and transferred the powers of government, territories, and revenues to the British Crown. The features of this act were: firstly, it provided that India henceforth was to be governed by and in the name of Her Majesty. It changed the designation. It changed the designation of Governor General of India to that of Viceroy of India. He, Viceroy, was the direct representative of the British Crown in India. Lord Canning thus became the first Viceroy of India. And secondly, it ended the system of double government by abolishing of the board of control and the court of directors. So these two bodies was abolished in this act. And thirdly, it created a new office, Secretary of State for India, vested with complete authority and control over Indian administration. The Secretary of State was a member of British cabinet and was responsible ultimately to the British Parliament. It established 15 new members. It established a 15 new member council of the India to assist the Secretary of State for India. The council was an advisory body. The Secretary of State was made the chairman of the council. And lastly, it constituted the Secretary of State in Council as a body corporate capable of suing and being sued in India and in England. The Act of 1858 was, however, largely confined the improvement of administrative machinery by which the Indian government was to be supervised and controlled in England. It didn't alter in any substantial way the system of government that prevailed in India. So this was the first act, and now we'll know about the second act. Look, in this series, this is the first act, Indian Council Act of 1861. Why am I saying that this is the first act? Because in series 1861, 1892 and 909, all these three acts were in a sequence. Why am I saying that these were in sequence? You will understand after some time, because Indian Councils Act of 1861, after the Great Revolt of 1857, the British government felt the necessity of seeking corporation of Indians in the administration of the country. In pursuance of this policy of association, three acts were enacted by the British Parliament in 1861, 1892 and 909. The Indian Councils Act of 1861 is an important landmark in the constitutional and political history of India. The features of this act were: it made a beginning of the representative institutions by associating Indians with the law-making process. It thus provided that the Viceroy should nominate some Indians as non-official members of his expanded council. In 1862, the Lord Canning, then the Viceroy, nominated three Indians to his legislative council: the Raja of Banaras, the Maharaja of Patiala, and Sir Dinkar Rao. Secondly, it In it initiated the process of decentralization by restoring the legislative powers to the Bombay and Madras presidencies. It thus reversed the centralizing tendency that started from the Regulating Act of 1773 and reached its climax under the Charter Act of 1833. This policy of legislative devolution resulted in the grant of almost complete international autonomy, the complete internal autonomy to the provinces in 1937. It also provided for the establishment of new legislative council for Bengal, northwestern provinces and Punjab, which were established in 1862, 1860, 1886 and 1897 respectively. It also provided for the establishment of new legislative councils for the Bengal, Northwestern Province, and Punjab, which were established in 1862, 1886, and 1897 respectively. It empowered the viceroy to make rules and orders for the more convenient transactions of business in the council. It also gave a recognition to the portfolio system introduced by Lord Canning in 1859. Under this, a member of the Viceroy's Council was made in charge of one or more departments of the government and was authorized to issue final orders on behalf of the council on matters of his departments. It empowered the viceroy to issue ordinances without the concurrence concurrence of the legislative council during an emergency. Life of such an ordinance was 6 months. So the ordinance was started in Indian history from this act. So this was the act, and now we'll know about Indian Councils Act of 1892. The features of his act the features of this act were: it increased the number of additional non-official members in the central and provincial legislative councils, but maintained the official majority in India. And it increased the functions of legislative council and gave them the of discussing the budget and addressing questions to the executive. And thirdly, it provided for the nomination of some non-official members of the Central Legislative Council by on recommendation of the provincial legislative councils and Bengal chambers of commerce, and secondly that of the provincial legislative councils by the governors on the recommendation of district boards, municipalities and universities, trade associations, zamindars and chambers. Made a limited and indirect provision for the use of election in filling up some of non-official seats both in central and provincial legislative councils. The word election was not, however, not used in this act. The process was described as nomination made on the recommendation of certain bodies. So now we'll know the Act Indian Councils Act of 1909. So this is the very most important act. Very most important act. This act is also known as the Morley-Minto reforms because Lord Morley was the Secretary of State for India and Lord Minto was the Viceroy of India in that time. So this act is also known as the Morley-Minto reforms. The features of this act were as follows. It considerably increased the size of legislative councils, both central and provincial. The number of members in the Central Legislative Council was raised from 16 to 60. The member of members, the member of members in the provincial legislative councils was not uniform. It retained official majority in the Central Legislative Council but allowed the provincial legislative councils to have a non-official majority. And lastly, it enlarged the it enlarged the deliberative functions of the legislative councils at both levels. For example, members were allowed to ask supplementary questions, move resolution on the budget, and so on. And next point is it provided for the first time for the association of Indians with the Executive Council of the Viceroy and Governors. Satyendra Prasad Sinha became the first Indian to join the Viceroy's Executive Council. He was appointed as the law member. It introduced a system of communal representation for the Muslims by accepting the concept of separate electorate. Under this, the Muslim members were to be elected only by the Muslim voters. And the act legalized communalism, and Lord Minto can be known as the father of communal electorate. And lastly, it also provided for the separate representation of presidency corporations, chamber of commerce, universities, and zamindars. So this was the Morley-Minto reform. And now we'll discuss about Government of India Act of 1919. On August 20, 1917, the British government declared for the first time that its objective was to gradual introduction of responsible government in India. The Government of India Act of 1919 was thus enacted, which came into force in 1921. This act is also known as Montagu-Chelmsford reforms because Montagu was the Secretary of State for India and the Lord Chelmsford was the Viceroy of India. The features of this Act of 1919 were: it provided for unification of all subjects of administration into two categories, namely the central subjects and the provincial subjects. This classification was done by the devolution rules framed under the Act. These rules facilitated the delegation of authority from the center to the provinces. In this in this way, the act relaxed the central control over the provinces. The central and provincial legislatures were authorized to make laws on their respective list of subjects. However, the structure of government continued to be centralized and unitary. And secondly, further divided the provincial subjects into two parts, transferred and reserved. The transferred subjects included public health, education, local self government, agriculture, etc. While the reserved subjects included police, administration of justice, prisons, land revenue, finance, etc. The transferred subjects were to be administered by the governor with the aid of ministers responsible to the legislative council. Look, this is very important point that the transferred subjects were to be administered by the governor with the aid of ministers responsible to the legislative council, and the reserved subjects on the other hand were to be administered by the governor and his executive council without being responsible to the legislative council. So this dual scheme of governance was known as diarchy, a term derived from the Greek word diarche, which means double rule. So basically, this is in reality the first time diarchy system. So it is asked in many times in exams. So it is very important point. So it can be asked that when the diarchy system introduced. So it is very important. However, this experiment was largely unsuccessful. And thirdly, it introduced for the first time by commercialism and direct elections in the country. Thus, the Indian Legislative Council was replaced by a bicameral legislature, bicameral legislature consisting of an upper house, council of state, and a lower house, legislative assembly. The majority of members of both of houses were chosen by direct elections. It required that the three of the six members of Viceroy's Executive Council, other than the Commander in Chief, were to be Indian, and it extended the principle of communal representation by providing separate electorates for the six Indian Christians, Anglo Indians, and Europeans. It granted franchise. It granted franchise to a limited number of people on the basis of property, tax, or other qualifications. It granted franchise to a limited number of people on the basis of property, tax, or the other qualifications. It created a new of the High Commissioner for India in London, and transferred to him some of the functions So what is basically this functions hitherto performed by the Secretary of State for India. And the eighth point is it provided for the establishment of Public Service Commission. Hence, a Central Public Service Commission was set up in 1926 for recruiting civil servants. It also separated for the first time provincial budgets from the central budget and authorized the provincial legislatures to enact their budgets. It provided for the appointments of a statutory commission to inquire into and report on its working after 10 years of its coming into force. It proposed the establishment of a chamber of princes, also known as the Narendra Mandal. The chamber was inaugurated in 1921. It consisted of the 120 members princes of 108 states and 12 representatives of other states. It was headed by a viceroy, governor general. It facilitated the consultation of discussion on the matters of common interest. So this was the act, and now we'll know about Simon Commission. In November 1927, 2 years before the schedule, in November 1927, the British government announced the appointment of a 7-member statutory commission under the chairmanship of Sir John Simon to report on the condition of India under its new constitution. All the members of the commission were British, and hence all the parties boycotted the commission. The commission submitted its report in 1930 and recommended the abolition of diarchy, extension of responsible government in the provinces, establishment of a federation of British India and princely states. This uh, sorry continuation of communal electorate and so on. To consider the proposal of the commission, the British government convened 3 round-table conferences of the representatives of the British government, British India, and Indian princely states. On the basis of these discussions, a white paper on constitutional reforms were prepared and submitted for the consideration of the Joint Select Committee of the British Parliament. The recommendations of this committee were incorporated with certain changes in the next Government of India Act of 1935. So this was what this was Simon Commission. And now we'll discuss about communal award. So what is communal award? In August 1932, Ramsay MacDonald the British Prime Minister announced a scheme of representation of the minorities, which came to be known as the Khan Award. The award not only continued separate electorates for the Muslims, Sikhs, Indian Christians, Anglo Indians, and Europeans, but also extended it to the depressed classes, scheduled castes. Gandhiji was distressed over this extension of the principle of communal representation to the depressed classes and undertook a fast unto death in Yavarda jail, Pune. Uh, in Yavarda jail, Pune, to get the award modified. At last, there was an agreement between the Congress and Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, the leader of depressed classes. The agreement, known as the Pune Pact, retained the Hindu joint electorate and gave reserved seats to the depressed classes. The British government accepted the Pune Pact and modified the communal award in respect to the depressed classes scheduled castes. This means that the provisions of separate electorates for the depressed classes were dropped from the scheme of representation contained in the communal award. Subsequently, the provisions of the Pune Pact were incorporated in the next Government of India Act of 1935. In other words, the composition of the central and provincial legislatures under the 1935 Act was based on this modified communal award. So this was the act, and now we'll discuss about Government of India Act of 1935, and this is very very important. If I say this is very most act in this chapter, so then it will not be the extra words. The Act of 1935. The act marked as second milestone towards a completely responsible government in India. It was a lengthy and detailed document having 321 sections and 10 schedules. The features of this act were: it provided for the establishment of an all India Federation consisting of provinces and princely states as units. The Act divided the powers between the centre and units in the terms of three lists: federal list, provincial list, and concurrent list. So the federal list for center having 59 items, and the provincial list was for the provinces with 54 items, and the concurrent list for the both with 36 items. Residuary powers were given to the viceroy. However, the federation never came into being as the princely states did not join it. It abolished diarchy in the provinces and introduced provincial autonomy in its place. The provinces were allowed to act as autonomous units of administration in their defined spheres. Moreover, moreover, the Act introduced responsible governments in provinces. That is, the government was required to act with the advice of ministers responsible to the provincial legislature. This came into effect in 1937 and was discontinued in 1939. And third, provided for the adoption of diarchy as the center. Consequently, the federal subjects were divided into reserved subjects and transferred subjects. However, this provision of the Act did not come into operation at all. And fourth point is it introduced bicameralism, bicameralism in 6 out of 11 provinces. Thus, the legislatures of Bengal, Bombay, and Madras, Bihar, Assam, and the United Provinces were made bicameral, consisting of a legislative council under legislative council. It was the upper house, and a legislative assembly, the lower house. However, many restrictions were placed on them. It reserved a certain number of general seats for the depressed classes, scheduled castes. It also extended the special representation to women and labor, means workers. It abolished the council established by Government of India Act of 1858. So it abolished the Council of India established by the Government of India Act of 1858, and the Secretary of State for India was provided with a term of advisors. It extended franchise about 14%, about 14% of the total population got the voting rights. It provided for the establishment of a reserve bank of India to control the currency and credit of country. So if sometimes asked that when the Reserve of India RBI was established, so your answer will be in Act of 1935. So this was the act when Reserve Bank of India was established. And next, the provided for the establishment of not only a federal public service commission but also a provincial public service commission and joint public service commission for 2 or more provinces. It provided for the establishment of a federal court which was set up in 1937, and it separated Burma, now Myanmar, from India. So when was the Burma, today's Myanmar, was separated from India? So your answer should be in Act of 1935. Basically, in this, the government of British, so we can say British government follows, so followed the rule divide and rule. It created 2 new provinces of Orissa and Sindh. It provided for safeguards to protect the interests of minorities, and it also provided for the establishment of a federal railway authority to look after the administration of railways. And it also provided for the appointments of an Auditor General of India and Auditor General of India to audit the accounts of Federation and the provinces. So this was the very most important act, as I soon told to you. And now we'll know about Indian Independence Act of 1947, and this is a significant act in which India got freedom. Indian Independence Act of 1947. On February 20, 1947, the British Prime Minister Clement Attlee declared that the British rule in India would end by June 30, 1948, after which the power would be transferred to responsible Indians' hands. So, this announcement was followed by the agitation by the Muslim League demanding partition of the country, because, as you know, Muslim League demanding for Pakistan. Again, on June 3rd, 1947, the British government made it clear that any constitution framed by the Constituent Assembly of India formed in 1947 cannot apply to those parts of country which were unwilling to accept it. And on the same day, June 3rd, 1947, Lord Mountbatten, the Viceroy of India, forth put forth the partition plan known as the Mountbatten Plan. And the plan was accepted by the Congress and the Muslim League. Immediate effect was given to the plan by enacting the Indian Independence Act of 1947. So this was very important. And now we'll know about all features. First, it ended the British rule in India and declared India as independent and sovereign state from August 15, 1947. And secondly, it provided for the partition of India and creation of two independent dominions of India and Pakistan with the right to ceded from the British Commonwealth. It abolished the office of viceroy and provided for each dominion a governor general who was to be appointed by the British king on the advice of Dominion cabinet. His Majesty's government in Britain was to have no responsibility with respect to the Pakistan. Assemblies of the two to frame and adopt any constitution for their respective nations, and to repeal any act of the British Parliament, including the Independence Act itself. It empowered the constituent assemblies of both of the dominions to legislate for their respective territories till the new constitutions were drafted and enforced. No act of British Parliament passed after August 15, 1947 was to extended was to extend to either of the new dominions unless it was extended uh, thereto by a law of law of the legislature of dominion. and it also abolished the office of the Secretary of State for India and transferred these functions to the Secretary of State for Commonwealth Affairs, and it proclaimed the lapse of British paramountcy over the Indian princely states and treaty relations with tribal areas from August 15, 1947, and it granted freedom to Indian princely states either to join the dominion of India or dominion of Pakistan or to remain independent. It provided for the government. It provided for the governance of each of the dominions and the provinces by the Government of India Act of 1935 till the new constitutions were framed. The dominions were, however, authorized to make modifications in the Act. It deprived the British monarch of his right to veto bills or ask for reservation of certain bills for his approval. But this right was reserved for the Governor General. The Governor General would have full power to assent to any bill in the name of His Majesty, and it designated the Governor General of India and the provincial governors as constitutional heads of the states. They were made to act on the advice of respective council of ministers in all matters. It dropped the little, sorry, it dropped the title of Emperor of India from the royal titles of the King of England, and it discontinued the appointments to civil service and reservation of posts by the Secretary of State for India, and the members of the civil services appointed before August 15, 1947 would continue to enjoy all benefits they were entitled to uh, till that time. At the stroke of midnight of 14-15 August 1947, the British rule came to an end and the power was transferred to the two new independent dominions of India and Pakistan. Lord Mountbatten became the first Governor General of new dominions of India. So India's first independent first who was the first? One second. The first Governor General was Lord Mountbatten of independent India. The Constituent Assembly of India, formed in 1946, became the Parliament of Indian Dominion. The members of both the interim government 1946 and the first cabinet of independent India 1947 are mentioned in tables 1.1 and table 1.2 respectively. So we'll know, and well, when we discuss on these tables, we'll know deliberately. So these are two tables, and first table is, as I said, interim government 1946, and these are the 14 members. First is Jawaharlal Nehru, So on the one hand members are given, on the other hand portfolios held are given. So Jawaharlal Nehru was the member, vice president of council, external affairs and commonwealth relations. And second, Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel, home, information and broadcasting. So Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel was home and information and broadcasting. And so Dr. Rajendra Prasad became food and agriculture portfolio, part of food and agriculture portfolio system. And Dr. John Mathai industries and supplies, and Jagjeevan Ram labor, Sardar Baldev Singh defense, C.H. Bhabha works, mines and power, and Liaquat Ali Khan फाइनेंस. इसके अलावा अब्दुल राव निश्तर was the posts and air, and the Asaf Ali railways and transport, and C. Rajgopal Achari education and arts, and Sundarigar commerce, and Ghaznafar Ali Khan health, and Jogendra Nath Mandal was part of law portfolio system. And the second table is also given here. So on the one hand there are given members, and on the other hand the portfolios held are given. The first cabinet of independent India 1947. So this was the today's first chapter, and we streamed the first chapter. So we'll meet in next chapter. Till then, bye bye and take care. Jai Hind, Jai Bharat.